Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much, the excellencies, parliamentarians, and distinguished guests who are in the room. Thank you for honoring me with your time. I know it's valuable. It's one of the things we can't get back in life, and you're here today to share with me. So thank you so much for coming and being part of this time. And as Darlene said, there will be a time for Q&A. I will try to keep the pace of the talk at a steady rate so that we can get to that time. Because I do think it's valuable for you to have an opportunity to respond, to share your questions, and I will do my best to engage those. I can assure you I did not bring this weather with me. Washington, D.C. was 27 degrees yesterday, and the cherry blossoms are in bloom. So for those of you who have been there before, you know that's a beautiful sight, and it's a beautiful city during that time of the year. So at this point, we've had food for our stomachs. I hope to give you some food for thought, and hopefully there are some things here that would be helpful. I realize that we are in a very international room. That to me, this may be the most international room I have ever been in my life. I think that's the case. And I think that that's an incredible picture of humanity, and I just want to say that up front. What a privilege it is to sit at tables and in a room with people from all over the world. And at a time where it seems that polarization is pulling at the fabric of society, we can sit together and have a meal. And I think that's a beautiful thing and something worth noting. So thank you so much for coming, and for those of you, we had a robust discussion at our tables. I'm sure you did as well, and hopefully that can continue even hereafter. Our topic today is something that I think many of you probably relate to, some of you more directly than others. The question and the challenge of making headlines, of being part of a public discussion where you may not even be a participant in that discussion. And one of the things I've noticed about the way that our interaction in society is changing is that questions are not necessarily perceived the same way as they were in the past. I don't know about you, but I've noticed that when people are asking questions, there's a hesitancy to actually embrace giving an answer because of the assumption that the reason the person's asking you is to leverage your answer against you. To find some kind of stereotype, to find some way to fit you into the box that they want to actually attack. And so questions have become part of an arsenal. And I think that's unfortunate because for me, I don't know about you, but if I'm trying to build a relationship with somebody or meet someone, I have to ask questions. It's the fundamental way that we get to know each other, that we seek understanding before we seek to be understood. And so to live in a time where questions are perceived as a step of hostility or aggression is so unfortunate. And I will say, as a believer in God and as a Christian in particular, I'm so grateful to have a belief in a God who's relational. Because the first step of relationship is always questions. And that's the same for Christianity and how I relate to God. That I believe God is personal, that He can be known, and that begins by asking questions. And so I hope that this is a place today where you feel welcome to do that. Even if you have an objection, it won't be the first time that I've heard those, so please feel free to vocalize that as well. We really are here, and I want to make the most of the time. So I've noticed something in my travels. All of you are international, and one qualification, I'll be speaking about the Western world. I'm going to speak about my context. I'm not going to speak to you about yours. But I think there's enough here to draw parallels about something that's going on not just here in the West, but globally, internationally. And what I've seen is a growing skepticism towards those in leadership among people. And a growing mistrust in the systems and the institutions by which people become leaders. I don't know if you've seen that yourself, but it seems that there's a widespread hesitancy about this. That in general, it's assumed that ultimately people are about themselves and their own agenda. And it's only a matter of time until something surfaces that vindicates that suspicion and provides an opportunity for those in opposition to capitalize on some kind of past or present failure that demonstrates the utter disqualification not only of that person, but anyone who's directly associated with them. Anyone who even holds their view. And it's that attitude and that approach that I think has put us under a tremendous pressure in our times. And it has presented an enormous difficulty about dialoguing with issues because a political argument will never beat a moral argument. If you can demonstrate that somebody's character is suspect, then their position is invalid. And that seems to be the approach in our time. Does any of that sound familiar to you in what you've observed? I think we can all think of examples, given this kind of pattern of polarization that characterizes the society that we live in here today. And it's not the first time. Allegations are not new. Political mischaracterization and mudslinging is a thing of the past. The Whig Party in the United States in 1848, they criticized a presidential hopeful, Lewis Cass, as being a pot-bellied, mutton-headed cucumber in response to the Democrats' accusation that opposing candidate Zachary Taylor is among other things a poor dresser. So we know that this goes back into history, and maybe the 48 years prior to that in 1800, the Federalists mounted the ultimate smear campaign claiming that Republican candidate Thomas Jefferson had died. That's a pretty disqualifying fact if true. So allegations have come and gone. But what about instances of actual failure? What about instances where integrity really has collapsed? Real misdeeds, whether past or present. It seems in recent trends that forgiveness is no longer an option. And I found it interesting, Canada's own Jordan Peterson, when asked the question, how do you move forward in life after having made or regretted a huge mistake? He paused extensively at that question. And I found it very interesting. Eventually when he spoke up, he said even though he's not a believer or professing Christianity, he pointed to the Bible. And he says, one of the interesting things about these silly people is that they're constantly making mistakes. People in the Bible. And that's true. He mentions Abraham, a man called and chosen by God in Genesis 12. And he's a man who made catastrophic mistakes. Immediately after God makes a covenant commitment to Abraham, he then goes to Egypt with his wife. And he turns to his wife and he says, honey, you're very beautiful. And they're going to notice that. Let's call you my sister for this trip. Because then they won't kill me, they'll let me live, and hopefully they'll treat you well too. So Abraham, after making the first covenant relationship with God, throws his wife under the bus to save his own skin. And this man is called the father of faith. So the Bible, the narrative of the Bible does not shy away from the fact that these are very imperfect people who do make mistakes, sometimes repeated mistakes. There are many examples of that in the Bible. And I think it's one thing that Christianity often, unfortunately, is mischaracterized. Christians are often mischaracterized as claiming moral superiority. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not true. The Christian position is one of a humble receptivity, of a needed forgiveness. It's not the moral high ground. And the Bible has also served as a foundation for something else, for redemption. And historically, that story of redemption has been the story of Western religion. Confession, repentance, redemption, reconciliation, and restoration are part of the working of Western society historically. And so taking responsibility, asking for forgiveness, pledging to do differently, that model of interaction has proceeded from the Judeo-Christian worldview, but increasingly the West is abandoning religion. And Pew Research continues to report the rise in what is called the religious nuns, no affiliation. In addition to that, there's been a reorientation towards truth. Now, historically, it's been the case that truth was considered an authoritative category. What people believed to be true had bearing on their lives. And so we lived life top down. We had our paradigm for truth, and through that lens of what is true about life and about me and about you is how I filtered my experiences and understood my existence. But that has now been inverted. We now, in my generation in particular, take a bottom-up approach to life, where I filter my truth through the lens of my experience and my feelings. It's a reorientation of truth. And it has massive implications for how society works. Because now nobody's held accountable to an oppressive absolute category. They are left to themselves to draw conclusions. And there are several who have traced this pattern to the point of a disempowerment of truth. One who I think very insightfully points to this is Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Some of you have maybe heard from him. He lives in London. And he traces a 4-century progression of the secularization of the Western world, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The first is the secularization of knowledge that came through the Enlightenment. The second is the secularization of power that came through revolutions, 1776, the American Revolution, 1789, the French Revolution. 19th century, the secularization of culture through the evolution of arts, where people, instead of going to the cathedral and to worship, to that experience of the sublime and awe and wonder, started going to the museum and to concerts to encounter the transcendent. And then the 20th century, the secularization of morality, demonstrated at its height maybe in the 60s. Some of you have lived through that time. During what was called the sexual revolution, the questioning of things like the sanctity of life and the covenantal nature of marriage. And now here we are in the 21st century. And what has been the entailment of this progression? I would suggest to you that the entailment has been the disempowerment of truth. That as a society, we have removed the transcendent, absolute structures that governed the way that we behaved between and with one another. The way we understood what it meant to take responsibility, to confess, to ask for forgiveness, to have integrity. So in this new orientation that's considered post-truth, it's not rooted in facts or reason, it's rooted in feelings and preferences. It's not a denial that truth exists, it's a relegation of truth to what I want, to beneath that. So what happens in a society when truth is no longer a factor bearing on what people decide for their lives, and they're left to decide subjectively for themselves? What is then left to determine what's right or wrong? If your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth, then whose truth is true? And how do we determine? I don't know if you've heard that phrase, share your truth. It's very common these days. Well, is your truth true? Maybe I should think about that twice. I don't know. I mean, we just met. I hope it is. But this is a dilemma for us now. So we're left creating truth for ourselves. And if you don't have a way to determine what's right or wrong, then the only solution left will be power. And that's what we see. Enter the outrage industry of our time. The new standard of justice by which repentance is impossible and by which we must assume the worst about everybody else, especially those we disagree with. Ladies and gentlemen, the weapon of our time is not information based on fact, but blame and shame. And perception is the new reality. And if you can create a perception of somebody that is counter to what our society deems as acceptable, then you can disarm them entirely. So 2 cases come to mind. I'm going to share one of those for time's sake. Recently, there was an instance in thinking about how now that affects how our society and our culture responds to public failure. There's a governor in Virginia, Democratic governor, who recently, you may be familiar with him, Governor Ralph Northam. And recently, it surfaced that it is claimed or alleged that he was in a picture from 1984 in his medical school yearbook that included a picture of 2 men, one wearing blackface, which is where a white person puts black paint on his face, and the other in a Ku Klux Klan outfit. And there's no question that a photo like that would provoke massive offense for good reason. And this photo, understandably, brought an explosive reaction, both from Democrats and Republicans. So what are the facts? Well, Northam initially gave a public apology. But shortly after that, he claimed that he actually wasn't in the photo. Ultimately, we don't know, because you can't tell in the photo, you can't see clearly whether or not it's him or not. You can't identify it, though his name is listed underneath it. So if he's not, then he should be acquitted, though it raises questions about why he originally made an apology. It's confusing. Assuming he is in the photo, Governor Northam did something reprehensible 34 years ago. Something that in the least is racially insensitive and at most is racist. Since that time, this photo, he has lived for 30 years, both personally and professionally meritorious when it comes to racial issues. Not a single instance of anything.
There's nothing to suggest that he has retained any kind of racism in his speech or in his actions. So the question is, should we disregard his entire life's record because of a racist picture from 34 years ago? What do you think? As Princeton professor Robert George points out, lots of people are racially insensitive out of ignorance and stupidity rather than outright bigotry. And I think there's many examples we can look in our society where offense is being taken because of a lack of understanding and not necessarily a proactive attempt to be hostile or demeaning or discriminatory towards another person. Additionally, Northam was raised in a cultural context with residual prejudice in the American South. So how did people respond? Well, I was at University of Virginia not too long ago, and I sat down with some students to ask them what they thought. University of Virginia is considered the #1 public education in the United States, founded by Thomas Jefferson. And in that conversation, I asked them, what do you think should happen? And their response was unanimous. They said he should be judged in light of that photo, he should be forced out of office, and he should never be able to enter politics again. That was their response. What's interesting about this case to me is that shortly after all of this came out, it wasn't just the governor alone who was guilty of such an act. The Virginia Attorney General admitted to wearing blackface. And to throw fuel on the fire, the lieutenant governor was accused by 2 women of sexual assault shortly thereafter as well. This is a bad time for Democrats in Virginia. It's an absolute PR nightmare. And this is what I find fascinating. When the situation involved just Northam, there was a demand from both parties for his resignation. But as these other offenses and allegations surfaced, the Democrat detractors became very silent. According to the New York Times, after a week in which denunciations were the norm, Democratic lawmakers avoided speaking to the press. And a pledge from one delegate to begin an impeachment proceedings had been completely stalled, accompanied by a refusal to participate in an interview. Interesting. The immediate backlash and cascading condemnations from politicians subsided. Why? Well, according to a somewhat speculative article in the Wall Street Journal shortly thereafter, when it was one administrator involved, it would be realistic to go get another Democrat in office. But 3 would be such a disruption in the succession of office that it was a threat for a Republican inroad. So here we see a possible example of outrage proportional to opportunity. That opportunity closed, and that outrage ceased. And it raises serious questions about whether we care about the truth and justice from real convictions, or whether we leverage things as true when it's politically expedient to do so, and ignore them when it's not. Now, there are lots of other examples of this, and I'm choosing to use American examples because I would like to visit this beautiful country again one day. So thank you for permitting me to be an American. Normally, if you've done something that you regret, or something that you know is wrong, there's several options that people have resorted to deal with that. The first is this: you can publicly confess, preemptively. This is things like Liam Neeson did in a recent interview, an actor who confessed to having a bout of violent anger toward people of color because a family member or a close friend of his had been assaulted by a person of color. And he publicly confesses this, but then he also condemns it. He says there's something primal about this, and he recounts his feelings. He says it's horrible. It's horrible when I think back that I did that. But he wasn't met with grace. He was met with hostility. And so there's the option of a public confession. Also, there can be skepticism about that. Maybe somebody's doing that so they can be inoculated from scrutiny. Might as well just come out. One Democratic candidate in the United States just released his whole rap sheet so that everybody would know preemptively and he wouldn't have to respond to accusations later. So the second option is to do the standard human thing, which is to feel regret, hope that nobody was majorly impacted, to seek repentance and move on. Hopefully learn from our mistakes and not repeat them. This would be the most common option, especially among those who are non-politicians and those who do not have a public platform. As you know, sitting in this room, your decisions have public consequences that other people do not. And then the third is to double down on original sin, on the original sin, and just to go for it and decide there's no hope for me, I'm going to jump all the way in. Here's the problem in our society today. That second option has been disincentivized. A post-truth culture has become inevitably a post-forgiveness culture because truth is inextricably linked to forgiveness. If you're going to take responsibility for something, it must be true that you've done something wrong. But we live in a society that says you decide what's right for you. And so it's like the problem of the moving goalpost. If you miss the mark, you just move the post. And at the end of the day, you are quite literally at the mercy of yourself, where you decide to do away with guilt by changing your own moral standards. And that's what a generation of people are doing today, not appealing to any absolute truth. And so to need forgiveness is to accept that you've done something wrong. But if you've done something wrong, it must be true. And it must be true that other people care about the thing that you did wrong. So you see, we've got our hands tied. We have no framework, no fabric with which to talk about needing forgiveness anymore, to take responsibility, to hold other people accountable. If nobody takes responsibility, you cannot hold anyone accountable. That would be hypocrisy. It requires taking responsibility, but the frameworks for that have been removed. So practically, what does this mean? Well, it means that the only people who will be able to engage in public life are those with absolutely no shame or who are entirely perfect, entirely pure. Now, looking around the room, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we'd say we don't fall, hopefully not into the first, but definitely not into the second category. I know I don't. I'm not perfectly pure or perfect. So what do we do? What do we do when you need mercy, you need forgiveness, and it's nowhere to be found? For many of us, entering into that kind of shame in a climate of today's culture is too much to bear. And I can understand that feeling. And public failure can be ultimately crushing. It can mean, and has meant for some, the loss of everything: reputation, career, finances, relationships. So where do we turn? This is where I think the Christian faith has something unique to say, and why I'm compelled, particularly by the Christian faith. The first is in the area of identity. It's one of the only places in the Christian faith where your identity, your sense of self, and your sense of self-worth is not primarily rooted in what you do. Every pattern in our world points to what you do as the source of your value. Your value is earned, and your value is based on your utility. And that results in the pride of upward comparison. It's not that you're proud to be good at something, it's that you're proud to be better at something than someone else. Now, this was exposed in my life when I went to the University of Oxford. You think you're smart until you go to the number one university in the world in your field, and you realize, wow, I wasn't proud that I was smart. I was proud that I was smarter than other people, and now I'm the last rung on the ladder in this atmosphere. And some of you have had this epiphany. Some of you need this epiphany. So there's this challenge of upward comparison. In the Christian worldview, your identity is not rooted in what you do. It's rooted in what has been done for you. The Christian claim is this: that none of us can ultimately earn the acceptance and love of God. It is freely given and must be freely received. And in doing so, you're receiving a statement of who you are, a statement of your value. It's a stable identity. Secondly, there is one who was willing to enter into the kind of public shame that, when considered in detail, is quite unspeakable, and that's Jesus. And he did that knowing he was innocent. In John 18, Jesus has been falsely accused. He's standing before Pilate, who is looking for some way to rightly condemn him as a rebel against Rome. So he asks him if he's claiming to be a king, because that would make him an insurrectionist. And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." The truth. What is the truth? I thought we were in a post-truth culture. The truth that while Jesus was falsely accused, none of us are falsely accused of having done, said, or thought something for which we need forgiveness, for which we owe a debt that we ourselves cannot pay. and the truth that God is prepared to absorb that debt for you on our behalf by making an exchange of a perfect life for your imperfect life. After that, Jesus is sentenced to be brutally beaten. Shortly thereafter, he's condemned to death by Roman crucifixion, even though he's an innocent man. You see, this is the funny thing, as I come to a close here, about mercy and justice. We live in a society that cries for justice. And I can understand that longing, a need for things to be reconciled, for people to be held accountable for their actions. But I think if we're honest, we also need mercy. You know where this plays out most clearly is on the roads, for those of you who are drivers. When you see that person violate a traffic law and you think, where's the police right now to pull them over? But then you're driving and you hear the whoop whoop and get pulled over, and all of a sudden, justice is very much secondary to the mercy that you want in that moment. Isn't that right? And so we live with this conflict. And why is there a conflict? Because when it comes to justice and mercy, the existence of one will always compromise the other. In all of philosophy, human thought, and religion, there is only one place where justice and mercy exist simultaneously, and that's the cross of Christ. Because on the cross, God was able to uphold his justice through the means of the extension of mercy and forgiveness to all of us who need it. It's an incredible intersection of two fundamental sources and important factors for our lives. And in that moment on the cross, Jesus' world was stripped away. On the cross, everything of support in Jesus' life was gone. His friends gave way in a shaming abandonment. His reputation gave way in a total humiliation. His decency gave way in being hung naked. His comfort gave way in a shaming torture. And his dignity gave way in the utterly undignified way that he died. Why did he do it? Why did Jesus go to that death? Well, we get a hint in Hebrews 12:2. It says this: "Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. And what that statement means is that for Jesus, he said the shame is incomparable to the joy for what the cross would do for you and for me. So your hope is secure in what Jesus has done. And I think we live in a time where many people are having to ask the question, how do I deal with the imperfections of my life? Because of what Jesus did on the cross for us, we can have a confidence that even if forgiveness is not available to you, around you, in your community, in your family, in your profession, it is available to you from the one who gave his son on a cross to die for you. And that's an invitation that if you haven't considered, and you haven't considered Jesus, that I would encourage you to consider personally, and I would love to talk to you more about that. Thank you so much for listening intently. We have, I think, a little time for Q&A, hopefully, so we'll start that. Thank you.